So I'm doing mine on satire and its role in mass media and news coverage, and then specifically a lot of the common pitfalls and biases that mass media as a whole falls into, and how satire, well, does fall into these same things because it is mass media, how it can use these biases, not necessarily to detract from it, and even use them to its advantage. All right, and so we're on the same page. So satire, by definition, is a genre that sets out to improve bad behavior through sarcasm and irony, which are two major elements. And then a satirist humorously depicts the current state of affairs and hopes that by doing so, he might improve it. And so the key word here is depicts. The satirist doesn't necessarily seek out to correct the problem or even to offer a solution. What he instead does is he illuminates the problem. He highlights it so that other people will notice what's going on and essentially be inspired to do their own thing, their own research to whatever it is he may be doing in his satire. All right, and so then according to the IBCC, there are 4 major points of philosophy bias that mass media in general falls under. And then by philosophy bias, I mean something that is inherent to mass media as a whole and not like a specific piece of mass media. Not like a content bias, for example, like a Democratic or like a Republican news station, but a news station as a whole. So it's because it tells news, it falls under these 4 things. The first of which is personalization, which you can think of it as individuals over institutions, where you represent large organizations or complex issues as one person. For example, we have a tendency to think of the federal government as the current president, so in this case, Obama. So the actions of the federal government will often be attributed to Barack Obama, whether or not he has any direct influence over that or not. It could be something he has no control over, something in Congress, or it can just be something that happened years ago building up to a point where he's now in control. And the next one is dramatization, which is like a twofold issue. The first one is a narrative presentation. So it's essentially making news stories stories. And so in order to do this, stories have a beginning, a middle, and end. And this can be a major problem in the news when, because current events are current, they might not even have an end by the time the story is written. And so this can often lead to problems when media fabricates endings or fabricates conclusions where none really exist, because people want to have the resolution when they read the article or watch the TV show or whatever it may be. And then the next part is sensationalist, which is essentially making an issue more interesting or more controversial, bigger than it needs to be, which can lead to a lot of problems. People rely on mass media as their primary source of information. And the third one is fragmentation, which is a pretty easy one to understand. It's treating stories in isolation. You don't often really go back and reread an article from, say, a year ago. You take it and it's the dose it's meant to be taken at that specific moment, and then you never really revisit it, so it lacks a lot of context. And the fourth one is authority bias, which is really related to the other 3. And it's pretty much because mass media is intended to reach the largest audience possible, it doesn't have a specific audience, it's aiming for the general public. And as the general public is essentially the most people, they often go against the authority, which is the small select number of people. And so then the mass media can use this and create conflict where none might not necessarily exist. All right, and so then a classical example of satire would be a Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal. And so then because we're going to be looking at the biases, and we don't really need to know too much about what he actually writes, instead we're just going to focus on how he writes and the biases that it falls into. So the main thing you really need to know is that the English had been repressing the Irish for centuries before John Swift, and now he's essentially fed up with the situation and wants to do something about it. All right. And so then, going back to the 4, the first sentence of his satire directly personifies the issue of poverty. He represents poverty as a whole, which is like a complex economic status, as a lone woman followed by 3, 4, 5, or 6 children. So because poverty as a whole can be difficult to solve, however, the poor status of one woman is a relatively easy problem. Next, he does dramatize his issue, which is one of the main strengths of satire, because the more outlandish or outrageous the satire is, the more memorable it is and the more attention it gets. And then later on, he doesn't fragment his issue too much, but he does dismiss a lot of the other proposals he has mentioned previously as like real proposals, you would say. and he does dismiss them and even states that he doesn't want them to be talked about until this one has been discussed. And then his entire argument is against the authority. It's the Irish people against the British government. So this is just another example right here of he's directly calling out the politicians and people in charge in England to actually come to Ireland and ask the people if they'd rather be dead and eaten or have to live through this perpetual poverty. So that's his authority bias. And then, so going now 200 years later, a modern example of satire would be John Oliver and his piece on passwords, where he's interviewing Edward Snowden. And again, the context isn't much as important as how he presents the information, so I'll just play it right now.
Why are passwords so important? Or why is it important that we have better ones than the ones that we do have? Because the ones that we do have are embarrassingly bad.
Bad passwords are one of the easiest ways to compromise the system. For somebody who has a very common 8-character password, it can literally take less than a second for a computer to go through the possibilities and pull that password out.
For an 8-character password?
Right.
My password is 5 characters. That's not a joke. That's bad, right?
That's really bad.
Okay, so which of these seem like good options? Password, but spelt W-E-R-D.
This is a joke, right?
No. Yes.
That would be within normal password dictionaries. Permutations of common words.
But it's misspelled though, so that was the kind of tripwire on it.
Right. It's still 8 characters, even if it's not within your password dictionary, which would mean
Okay. It's about what I had. That's why I got some more. 1, 2, 3, 4, but spelled out.
That's not going to help you.
Okay. Limp Bizkit Forever with Limp Bizkit spelled properly, but forever not.
That's also not going to help you.
Okay. Really?
I think the best advice here is to shift your thinking from passwords to passphrases. Think about a common phrase that works for you, but too long to brute force, and also make them unlikely to be in the dictionary.
Admiral Alonso Ghost Penis 420.
That's pretty good.
Right?
It's memorable.
Right, it's memorable. It's got all the other things you like characters and numbers. You love capital letters, obviously. I shouldn't say, now I can't use it.
It can actually be a lot harder to remember a password that they tell you has to be 13 characters long or something like that. It has to have exclamation points, it has to have numbers, it has to have uppercase and lowercase letters and things like that, than it is to remember a simple phrase like Margaret Thatcher is 110% sexy.
Wow. That is a password that not even a computer would guess. Now you're right. Okay, I get it. I get how important it is. I fully understand that. The problem is, I'm not going to do it. Because it seems hard, even though I know it isn't.
You're killing me.
Sorry.
Alright. So moving on, so even though his piece is produced 200 years later than Jonathan Swift's, his piece of satire still falls under these 4 major pieces of media bias because it is mass media. And so then personalization is rather easy to spot. Instead of getting, like, say, a textbook answer or a textbook response, John Oliver brings in the actual person, Edward Snowden. And so although it might not be personal to, say, me or you, it's still more personal than the issue of, say, cybersecurity or network security, which is something many people don't even care about. But since it's coming from a person, more people would be willing to watch it and pay for his content that he's trying, because that's the overall goal of mass media, is to essentially, because it's mass, it needs to be supported by the masses. And so then dramatization, he does do this, not so much in the terms of the narrative structure, but he definitely brings in the sensationalism a little bit. He could essentially talk to any computer security guy or network engineer, and they'd give him a similar response. But he specifically brings in Edward Snowden, who, I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he's like a hugely controversial figure right now. And he's essentially throwing his weight behind the piece and making it more appealing to a wide variety of people who might not have otherwise watched it. And then fragmentation's rather easy spot in this one. It's a 3-minute long video Obviously, there's not a whole lot of context around a lot of the jokes and a lot of the setups, and without watching the larger episode as a whole, there's really no reason why John Oliver would even be talking about passwords. So it does suffer from that just as a result of the fact that it's also a weekly show and it's meant to be watched in that specific week, and then the topic might not ever be revisited again in the future. And then fourth is authority bias, which you don't see too much in this short clip, but it's definitely present in the larger episode as a whole, where he's talking about government surveillance and network security, but it was too long to show, so I can't really show it in this presentation. All right, and so then sort of in conclusion with satire as a genre, so satire as a genre has a lot of advantages when it comes to media bias that are advantages for satire, but would be detriments for traditional media, and this is largely due to the purpose behind satire. As I mentioned in the very beginning, the purpose of satire isn't necessarily to be portrayed as the most credible or most informative piece like a newspaper, but rather it's meant to illuminate issues. It's not meant to be the final destination for a person doing research, but rather it's meant to like spark interest in a topic. It's meant to make, say, someone who has no idea of what's going on and give them a reason to find out what's going on, as opposed to a newspaper, which intends to appeal to people by being this final source of information. And so while things like sensationalism and this narrative structure harms traditional sources of media, it plays to satire's advantage because it allows it to reach a larger group of people and appeal to a wider audience. And that's it.